Okay.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Grant Cameron, and I got a special guest today, Kathleen Marden, who I've known for a number of years. And I actually asked Kathleen to do the interview today because I'm very, very interested in what she's doing. I've made comments many times that I think we have to get past the UFO sightings, which tell us there's something going on, accept that as a reality, and then try to figure out who is behind this, why they're here, and what messages they might have for us. And there's only a few people that I recognize are actually doing this work. Kathleen Marden is one. She's a leading investigator and historian of UFOs and contact phenomena, the author of several books, featured on-camera commentator, and an international lecturer. She earned a BA degree in social work and was employed as an educator and an education services coordinator while attending graduate school. She is a practitioner of regression hypnosis and quantum healing hypnosis technique. Her interest in UFOs began in 1961 when her aunt and uncle Betty and Barney Hill had a close encounter and a subsequent abduction in the New Hampshire White Mountains. Since 1990, she has worked to uncover the truth about UFOs, most importantly, their occupants and human interactions with them, and the U.S. government's involvement in the UFO problem. Her research trips to archival collections, which I've also done, and her investigation of case after case of contact with humans had given her the depth of knowledge in that process. She has worked on 3 social research projects with nearly 5,000 experiencers, which is very impressive. And her books captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, Science Was Wrong, which I really love that book, and Fact, Fiction, Flying Saucers with nuclear physicist, scientific ufologist Stanton T. Friedman, who just passed away last year, with whom she worked for 14 years. Her book, The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner, gives an in-depth coverage on 2 of her major cases and 4 additional cases that she personally investigated. Her 5th book, Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, is a comprehensive guide to UFO abduction. She is a contributor to the Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation book, Beyond UFOs, The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence, which we'll be talking about today. Her essays have been published in several additional books and magazines. Her books are available in all formats on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. She has given on-camera commentary on the Discovery, History, National Geographic, Destination America, Science and Travel channels, and on several documentaries. So I want to welcome you, Kathy, to have this chat with me, and I'm very excited in trying to get some answers from you as to what is going on beyond the UFO sightings. How are you today?
Doing well, Grant. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Good to be with you.
Beautiful. I guess we'll start with a little bit about the part that's interesting me is the part with the experiencers, and you really were not really that public about that until a number of years ago when you sort of identified the fact that you were an experiencer. Can you talk about this area of research that we're going to get into here about who's behind the UFO phenomena and why they're here, what's the message? Can you get into that part of your background as to why you chose to do the experiencer thing for the MUFON group? And I understand you're the lead person and you have a number of people in MUFON who are working on this problem.
Yes, in all we have about 40 now. 5 are PhD psychologists or MD psychiatrists. The remainder are caring individuals who know a lot about investigation and research and can give non-judgmental support to experiencers at the same time. Not everyone wants to have an investigation. Some people just want to have some reassurance. So to begin to tell you about my becoming involved in studies, back in 2012, Denise Stoner, who's my co-author on the alien abduction files and who I work with very closely. She's a paranormal specialist. So we decided to do a small study together. And we were very interested in Kenneth Ring's Omega 1 and 2 academic studies on experiencers and his findings. We did a great deal of research about other academic studies that had been done and their findings. So we kind of formulated our 45 questions around the research results. And we also added some questions that pertain to the paranormal. So we had two groups. We had 50, it was a small study, 50 experiencers. We called them abductees in those days, and a 25-person control group. We wanted to attempt to identify commonalities that experiencers share that are not common in the general population. And we had some very interesting results, even though it was a small study and it was difficult to get to. You had to be highly motivated in order to get the study from me. I would send it to a person, they would have to complete it and then send it back to me. So it wasn't just having a massive amount of people going to a questionnaire online and completing it easily. We found that 88% of the experiencers who took part in this study said that they had had some kind of paranormal experiences going on at the same time, whether it be intelligently controlled light orbs in their homes, or the sensation that something unseen is walking on the bed, shadow people, some poltergeist activity, things flying off shelves and that sort of thing, which I found to be quite interesting. Then we met Ray Hernandez in 2013, shortly before he founded the first free organization. And we participated with him on doing another study. He had read the one that Denise and I had done. And so he wanted to do a very large study through free. So Denise and I both worked with him on that study, developing questions initially. And also I took part in some of the later phase 2 questions as well. And I'm on Free's board of directors. And I really value the work that they are doing. I think that they're doing groundbreaking research and that it's extremely important to do this as well, because you know, they're studying consciousness, and this appears to be all about consciousness and the idea that we are all one and share the same consciousness.
Now, the free organization, I believe, when you guys did the study, I think they had 3,000 plus in the data that they came to. And can you talk about the article? I think they've got the new book coming out. What is the article you're doing for their new book, and is it what we're talking about today?
I don't have time to do one for the new book. I wrote an article for Beyond UFOs.
Okay.
The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence. I wrote a chapter on the history of communication between non-human intelligence and humans, and different types, whether it was UFO abduction kind of contact with grays and the messages that were given versus telepathic downloads and the messages that were given, to give kind of an well-rounded discussion of what the messages that are being given. And
it's interesting that you used 2012, because that's when I had my sort of noetic experience where I was told this is all got to do with consciousness, and Ray Hernandez had his first experience in 2012, and you started it's almost like there was this sort of reversal what do you see? Because I know I always make the joke that in 2012 I couldn't have spelled the word consciousness and couldn't have cared less, and now it seems to be like the sort of a real buzzword. Have you seen the same sort of thing, that people are sort of moving away from the nuts and bolts and realizing there's something maybe much more complex than our original idea? You know, aliens are flying around in tin cans and this sort of thing.
I see a dichotomy. On one side, I see a group of people who have shifted away from the nuts and bolts toward an understanding of what all this means in human history and to humans in general. And then on the other side, I see nuts and bolts investigators who want to stick strictly to the nuts and bolts and be even more dedicated to that, because they think that the other part is unscientific, and they think that nuts and bolts investigation is scientific. I strongly disagree with that, but they're entitled to their own opinions.
I'm with you there. I mean, so what do you say when they say it's just anecdotal? It's because to me, it's whether you're reporting a UFO sighting or an abduction experience or a contact experience, it's all anecdotal. I mean, it's all coming through the filter of the human consciousness. So what do you say to them when they say, well, I'm conservative and these are just stories people are telling? How do you respond to that? You've done that a little bit, but give me your take on that.
Yes, and I would point them to the next study that I did with several people, Dr. Don C. Donderi, some highly educated people on MUFON's experiencer research team, on 516 experiencers, and the results of those studies that indicate that you can collect evidence from experiencers as well. There are the commonalities that have been done on social science studies. There are marks on people's bodies, patterned marks on people's bodies across the globe that are identical. How do you explain that? How do you explain the patterned fluorescent marks on people's skin? How do you explain the implants and the special characteristics that these implants have? So how can you say that contact is only anecdotal, when in fact there is so much evidence to be collected as well? And people need to open their minds to that. I mean, going all the way back to the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization versus NICAP, that was Coral Lorenzen and her husband who was saying, we want all of our investigators to include every statement in your report. We don't want you to censor out any information that's unscientific. And then you had organizations like NICAP who didn't want to entertain the idea that anyone was even on the craft, and that if there happened to be, they had to be robots. They couldn't be sentient beings. And so there was bias. And as I looked at this, I discovered that although APRO had many scientists, NICAP had many military people and intelligence people. And I think that might be why some do not want to entertain the idea that there is any intelligence on the craft.
Now, your aunt and uncle were sort of famous for being the first to come forward with these kind of reports. What kind of reaction did they get from, say, Major Kehoe and people on the board? Did they, because it would have been pretty bizarre. I mean, we had this ship land and they took us on board the ship and stuff. I mean, that never been heard before. Did they get a positive or sort of try to push them away? And
well, Walter Webb, who was an astronomer and worked at the Hayden Planetarium and had worked on Alan Hynek's satellite tracking project when he was at the Harvard Smithsonian Astrophysics Laboratory, they were interested in what Betty and Barney had to say, that Walter Webb wrote a fairly decent account, not entirely accurate, but a pretty good account of what happened. Walter told me when I was doing my research for Captured, I went down to his house, I interviewed him, he gave me some files, and he told me that if Betty and Barney had that UFO sighting, which he believed they did, that close encounter, then they also were abducted. NICAP, on the other hand, did not want to entertain the idea. I don't know what Donald Kehoe said about it, but there were people in NICAP who wanted to turn a blind eye to it. And so I think that that's what turned my aunt off to UFO groups. She was very much against UFO organizations, I think because of the treatment she received. And they had probably more evidence than anyone in the history of contact in the United States. And in the past several years, I've found scientists who have been able to do an analysis, and we have more compelling evidence that's coming out in the second edition of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, next April.
Wow.
I've updated it. So really exciting stuff. And, but Betty was very anti-UFO organization. And I think it was because of the bias. She liked Coral Lorenzen. Coral published about the star map in one of her books and seemed to be pleased with that. So Betty leaned more toward APRO, but of course, that became defunct after a time. I think it was in business longer than any UFO group.
Have you got an opinion on why there was a shift? Because as you know, in the 1950s, all the beings that were being talked about were the sort of the space brothers and human type, and then your aunt came along. And the one thing I found interesting at the very sort of where it sort of seemed to shift was the connection with Frances Swan, who happened to live down the road from your aunt, where she was into the sort of the blonde beings, and suddenly along comes Betty Hill and is telling this other story. Have you ever thought about why there was a shift, or maybe there was no shift, that we're just missing the data? Or how do you interpret that, where it's sort of like all the accounts seem to move from one type of being to another at the time when your aunt came forward?
I have given that some thought. And by the way, Betty and Barney knew Admiral Knowles and his wife Helen, and spent social time with them and with Wilbert Smith's wife. Wilbert had passed away at that time. Very interesting story and connection with Admiral Knowles. So why the shift? From what I've found, I've worked with people who are being contacted by the Greys dating back to the early 50s too.
Okay.
And the scientific investigators wanted to have nothing to do with those. I know of a report that was made, I think it was 1954 or 56, of a couple who had a close encounter and had a missing time event. And the UFO organizations just completely ignored it. They didn't want to investigate that kind of thing. And then, with people like George Adamski and the others who came along, they didn't know about the interdimensional part of contact that was already there. A lot of them still don't want to even think about that today. It's just gives them a brain cramp. And, and so, it's they just back in that time frame wanted to debunk all of this. And as I thought about that, I thought, well, what was the message that these space brothers were giving? It was a communist message.
Yeah.
If you really take a look at it, making humans into sharing individuals. They will help us, they will guide us, they will teach us, they will not favor one nation over any other. They will not give technology to one without giving the technology to the other. And from the way I think of it is, the military industrial state that was beginning back then said, absolutely not. We're going to dominate the world. We're not going to go for this nonsense. That belongs to our enemies, the Soviets. And, so I think that that's what happened there. And in all of the cases that I've investigated that started way back in the 40s and early 50s with Greys being present, I know it was going on back then as well. And the Greys had more of a medical role in all of it. And, the fear was promoted. But what I find is those non-human entities, the Greys, were giving reassuring statements to people. We're not going to harm you. We only need to do a few simple tests. We will let you go after we do these tests. We'll put you back in your car, or we'll put you back in your bed, or whatever it is, and you'll be safe and sound. We won't take very long. We love you. You're part of our family. Those messages have been given for a very long time, but have been kind of suppressed by those who wanted to put a negative spin on it, I believe.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on the idea, because it gets promoted very heavily as sort of the evil alien. This is a threat. We need to get Congress to give some money, and we have to, bring them down, and they're in our airspace, and they're shutting down our nuclear weapons, not letting us use our nuclear weapons and stuff like that. So how do you respond to people? Because you must get it way more than I do, is the whole evil alien thing.
In terms of the evil alien thing, I think that, the government is always looking for an enemy. Yeah. That's what we do around the world. We're still into this idea of nationalism is the only game in town. And
that's Stan's favorite line.
Stanton's. Yes. I just thought of him when I decided to say that. I miss him.
Yeah.
And how we're a highly competitive world with a lot of nations who are competing against one another for dominance. And that's the mindset. We don't, at a government level, have the mindset of promoting world unity, world harmony, peace among humans, and that sort of thing that the non-humans embrace. And the non-humans are actually showing the governments and the military around the world where there is nuclear weapons that we can control your weapons. We can shut them down. We can start them up like we did in the Soviet Union and really worry everybody. So I think it's just messages. And for years, over and over again, when people have been taken to craft, and even Frances Swan was told, the lady from Maine, who I'm talking about, but maybe the audience doesn't, the one we were just talking about earlier. Well, the message was that they are very concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. A lot of them say that where their experiment, they planted our seed here, and no one wants to see their experiment fail. And, this is a beautiful planet, and they are very concerned that we could destroy life on this planet through our behavior. And through the studies that I've worked on, I've discovered that experiencers have certain characteristics as a result of having these experiences. And they're very much like near-death experiencers, where they become more psychic. They become empathic, which is a psychic sense where you can feel another person's emotions as if they were your own. Some empaths can determine if there's an illness in the human body and heal that illness. But the point I'm trying to make here is when you're empathic, you can't hurt another individual without feeling their pain. So I think it's brilliant that they are in the process of kind of remodeling humans into something kinder and gentler. Whether humans want that to happen or not, it appears to be happening. And I know that these experiences are very widespread. So it seems like they're attempting to work with as many humans as possible to me.
Okay. You mentioned the empathic thing, which I sort of noticed in your study, and you distinguish in your study between abductees and contactees. Maybe you can sort of unpack that. And then this unbelievable stat that I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, with the abductees, it was 100% were more sort of empathic towards other people. It was very, very high percentage, whereas in the contactee group, it was way down.
Yes, yeah. So Dr. Don Derry did phase 2 of the study, and he and Bud Hopkins and Ted Davis, who was a psychiatric social worker from Long Island, developed the American Personality Inventory, and it was kind of based on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a measure of mental stability, psychological stability. And so they, through a very long process of questions and standardization, reduced it from 600 questions down to 65. And Dr. Derry worked on the standardization and had 3 groups. So they had the group who on the API tested as being, or as having UFO abduction syndrome, which meant that they had the knowledge and the psychological trauma that went along with alien abduction. Then there was the simulator group, and those were people who were basically wannabes. They knew a lot about it, but they didn't know enough to qualify as an abductee. And then there was the group of just everyday people who was like the control group, didn't know anything about the topic and didn't care, but maybe would take part in a study just to throw it off. We had many different controls in the study to identify these people and got rid of them. And then we isolated those so that we had everyone who was in a very wide range as abductees. It's what they called it in those days when this was developed. And we had a few that were right around the target range. They had all of the characteristics. So what we did is we had the experiencer group, all of those. Then we had the abductee group, which were those who were closest to the target. And then we had the group that was furthest away from the target, but still abductees. And in those, we had those who were having like highly spiritual, positive experiences, and then really negative kind of negative entity experiences as well. I went through a number of different titles for them, and I finally ended up deciding to call that group the contactee group, even though there were people who were having negative experiences too, just because the people I tried it out on were able to understand it, as opposed to group A or group B or whatever. So that's the way we did it, and we were able to acquire statistics on 118 questions. Some were open-ended, but we still were able to diffuse those into some statistical information. And we have some remarkable results. And yes, you said one of those was 100% of the experiencers were empathic. The experiencer group, the abductee group, the abductee group, those who were closest to the target, had characteristics at a highly significant, statistical significant rate that the other groups did not have. And that included things like, we asked the question, as all of the debunkers say, they're just all suffering from sleep paralysis. And so we asked, have you been sleeping and you woke up and you had sleep paralysis and it felt there were entities in the room? And a very high percentage said yes, they'd had that experience. And then we asked, have you been awake and have these non-human entities come into your environment and then you became paralyzed? And what we discovered was that a very high percentage of the abductee group said yes, they had had that experience, but it was only 36% among the experiencer group in general. So quite a large difference there. The abductee group had close encounters, had generational contact, had a fairly high percentage of people who were RH negative.
Okay, let me ask you about that. Let me stop you there because that's a question I always get as well. I'm RH negative, and people always want to do the poll. A lot of people don't know. So you probably get asked about that all the time, and you actually asked a question about it. So where do you stand on that?
Well, what we discovered is that 15% of the general population are RH negative. So 85% are RH positive. But on our study, we discovered that 31% of the experiencers are RH negative. Statistically significant, highly significant. But an even higher percentage of the abductee group are RH negative. I think it was 35%.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a puzzling little thing that people want to throw around all the time. And so you confirm there is some sort of connection, whatever that might be. There seems to be some truth to the story that this is maybe, and I guess you would agree with me, this is just a massive mystery that's probably 1,000 times more complex than we actually realize. And we're just picking up little clues as to what might be significant and what might not be significant.
Yes. Yeah. So, with every study we do, I think that we learn more. And I think it's really important that we are quantifying the data because I know we're all biased in a sense. If we're just listening to stories, if we're just doing hypnosis, we're seeing it from the point of view with our personal biases and from what people say. But if you have a large population of experiencers and they're all engaging in these statistical studies, it's, I think, a lot more valid than just reporting your feelings about what you perceive is happening.
Yeah, unfortunately, the skeptics don't look at the stats, even though you've got some pretty dramatic stats. Another one you have is the 50, and much higher than the free. Free had 39%. Had the near-death experience. You've got 54%. I think the national average is 7%. So you're like 8 times the national average. How did you relate that, the whole idea? Because the way I look at it is like, because everybody would say to me, and I think I even talked to Ray about this, isn't it weird how people look at it as random events? You just happen to be walking down the street and you get abducted, and then you just happen to have a near-death experience, another random event, and you have all these people with 2 random events, which makes you think, well, maybe this isn't random. So how did you interpret the high number of near-death experience cases when you found that in your study?
Well, I'm still scratching my head about that one. I'm not positive, but I did develop a theory about why experiencers have the characteristics that near-death experiencers have. And that pertains to what happens when you enter an interdimensional portal, when you're taken through a solid surface and your atoms are energized, they come apart. So many people have mentioned that they felt like they were coming apart in these portals and then put back together in craft. And, you know, so I think that they're having that same kind of experience where the soul or the consciousness separates as they go through this process of moving from one dimension to another and then back. I think it might be a lot like what happens in the near-death experience itself.
You're doing a study now on near-death experience, the connection between the two, because there's so many things that are familiar in terms of, I know I had the one contactee, I don't know if you use in your study, but Ron Johnson from Utah, who talks about being in the spirit world with his dead mother. And he goes into a building that's 10 times the size inside as it is outside. And a lot of experiencers will tell that story. And then you start seeing these connections and you're starting to think, well, are they having a sort of an out-of-body experience? Or are they having an abduction experience? And it's blurred the lines. Are you doing a study on the connections between the near-death experience and even the thing with the you know, supposedly near-death experience people can't wear watches and things like this? It's the same sort of, and have affect electronics and stuff, and you start seeing these things. So if you're doing a study, I think that would be very significant.
Yeah.
Just
Well, I'm only
Yeah.
I'm only on the advisory board. Lester Velez and oh gosh, I can't remember his name. He's a statistician,
Okay.
very in a very high standing. And so they've put this together and I'm on the advisory board. So I'm this is at the beginning,
Okay.
and I'm not certain if they're going to be having near-death experiencers as part of this, but it's going to be called the Omega 4 Project.
Okay.
So I'm just waiting to go to the next meeting so I can learn more about it, but I did tell them that I would be on the advisory board.
That's beautiful, because I think that's significant that people, that's why I think most people don't realize on the outside, there are these really bizarre statistics inside that make you go like, what? It's like, and it sort of says, yeah, this is, you got to go down this road because there seems to be something there, which gets to the thing. I think I asked you about this before, the idea of soul contract. Have you done regressions and had people go pre-birth and people talking about the fact that they are actually that's their family and this was planned? And have you gone through that? And maybe you can talk about that.
Yes, and a lot of that was the result of the work that Dolores Cannon did. And she, over a 40-year period, developed the quantum healing hypnosis technique. And I wasn't going to take that training. But the funny thing was that just before I'd wake up in the morning, over and over again, I would have this dream where Dolores came to me and said, Kathy, you really need to take this training. And so I finally said, okay, I'll do it. And so I'm actually a master practitioner of that now. And it's fascinating because when you do that, you actually speak to the person's sort of super conscious, beyond the subconscious mind, but you could call it the soul. And so you speak to that, and they always speak back in the third person. At that point, they can ask questions. This is after the hypnosis session itself. And I always ask them, since Dolores initially developed this as a past life regression, I asked, would you like to have past life as well as exploring experiences that you've had in your present life? And most people do want to do that. And what we find is that they had been a non-human in a previous life and had volunteered to come here to assist in human development. And if they weren't that, then they were humans in contact with non-humans in a previous lifetime. So that ended up being very, very interesting. We've gotten a lot of interesting information from the people that I've worked with. Unfortunately, we have COVID now, so I've closed my practice down until it's safe again.
Related to that, if you have this sort of like this sort of a concept that there might be an agreement, can you tie that into the messages? Because I think you get the messages that it's the same sort of thing. They've come here to help. And so talk a little bit about the messages that people are giving. And a question related, you can do, have you talked to any of the aerial school kids?
Yes, I've talked to 2 of them.
Oh, okay. So tie in the messages, then I got an aerial school question for you. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, you know, in the aerial school, those the messages that I know of were frightening, with the trees going down, with things that were just too heavy for a young child to have to internalize. And but you know, the non-humans came back, and you know, as I said earlier, over and over again, there's that message of saving planet Earth from destruction by, you know, the human race. And so that's part of it. But so many people are told on craft, or told by these non-humans wherever they see them, we love you, you're part of our family, we're all one. You know, so that's kind of a message that, you know, we're all working together. What was your perception on that?
Yeah, with the I lost my train of thought here.
Oh, sorry.
Well, the aerial school, the one thing that amazed me, it was sort of a thing that I had picked up, where they talked about the images coming in flashes. I don't know if you've gotten this, and if you've studied the Bankston healing, he runs the scientific exploration, William Bankston. He does a training on healing. It's called the Bankston healing. And what they do is they flip these images. They take ego images to shut down the left brain, and you memorize them and you flip them at a very high rate. And that's what these 2 girls were describing at the school, was the fact that these images were coming at this very high speed. And Susie Hansen describes being taken underground to 250 people sitting there, where they did the same thing again, where it's 100 more images a second going through. And that you see these things that there's no way anybody could make this up. I mean, this is like,
right.
So the messages, I think, are important. And this goes maybe a little bit to the hypnosis thing, because that's one of the criticisms that I guess you get a lot, is this thing with hypnosis. How many of the people who are, say, getting the messages or remembering stuff have had hypnosis, or are majority of them getting them through just ordinary recall?
I think that a lot of it is through ordinary recall. That's something that people remember. It can happen in their own home when the entities come into the home, and there's just like this rapid reeling. And Bud Hopkins talked about this, that it was, you know, the just rapid reeling of information, and people felt like information was being either extracted from their brains or put back in. Yeah, so that's been going on for a long time.
And the hypnosis thing, how do you answer that sort of thing? Well, you know, these people are just being led, and they're all this kind of stuff. It wouldn't explain, for me, it wouldn't explain the synchronicities that don't make any sense. Like, why would you make up a near-death experience? Why would you make up rapid image cycling? Some of these things are not in the ordinary world. So how do you address the criticism about hypnosis?
Well, I can't address that with what other people do, but in what I do, first of all, we have techniques that we can use to test a person's suggestibility. I interview people for a good 3 hours before I work with them. I've interviewed people for 8 hours before I've worked with them. And so I want to know everything that they have in their conscious recall, and test their level of suggestibility, if and what they've read, what they know. And I let them know that this could possibly come into their minds. But what I will do is use what techniques I have that can prevent that from happening. So that if they are tempted to add something that isn't part of their subconscious recall of what occurred, they will not be able to speak, or they will become very confused at that point. And also, I use a forensic hypnosis technique. Even though I do QHHT, I don't follow Dolores's prescription of asking loads and loads of questions. I ask as few questions as possible. That's what forensic hypnosis is. It was developed for use by law enforcement. In order not to lead the witness, in order to get pure information. And so any question is built upon what has already been offered by the person who's hypnotized.
Okay. One of the other statistics that I saw in your study was the one, and if Free had it, they had a little bit higher number than you, but it was this bizarre sort of thing where you're asked them the question, if you could end this thing and make it stop, would you make it stop? And you talk about that, and then I have another question.
Yes, well, 71% of the participants said, no, I don't want it to stop. And it was even higher among the abductee group. They wanted it to continue. And so we wanted to know why that was. And so we asked questions, and most people said curiosity, or they'd reached a stage in their lives where they were able to obtain more information, that these non-humans were now communicating information to them in ways that they didn't earlier in their lives. And they wanted the answers. And so they wanted it to continue. And a lot of people have been healed. I think it was 45% in our study of the abductee group. Yes.
Which I think I saw the near-death study figures. Somebody said 70% claim they can heal people. It's you get these really bizarre sort of synchronicities. In terms of the ending it, is it true? I think Free talked about this, that the more experiences you have, the less evil the whole thing appears. And maybe tie that into if you wrote a book about what to do if you found out you're an abductee. If you get somebody who's new, do you suggest that they try to figure out what's going on? How do you deal with that sort of thing? Does it and like, does it help? I mean, or do you have people that go off the cliff when they suddenly find out what's going on, or does it get better as they start to deal with what they've experienced?
Well, everybody is different, and so the book is just full of ideas and the stages that people go through as they process this information once they realize that it really is happening in their lives. And we teach people in the book the tools that they need to use in order to determine what is going on, because it could be a number of different things. So for those who are very frightened about what is occurring, I try to make it clear that people become frightened because of what they've read or what they've seen so frequently, or what they don't know. I've worked with people who had post-traumatic stress disorder, who after hypnosis or after EMDR therapy had found out they had a wonderful experience with human-looking entities who said that they lived on Earth thousands of years ago and just come back to check on us from time to time. But so many people develop trauma because they don't know what happened. They know what happened at the beginning of the experience. They saw the craft or they saw the non-humans, and then they were taken to an alien environment, but they don't know what beyond that, what happened. And it's interesting to me that such a high percentage were traumatized because of not knowing. And so it's important to look for answers, to learn, to talk to non-judgmental listeners. And that's why I took MUFON's experience, a research team, in the direction that I did. I'm too busy to work on that team on a day-to-day basis, but we have 35 people who talk to experiencers on a day-to-day basis. They only have to go to MUFON's website, go to the ERT page, and complete the questionnaire, which is confidential. So, and by reading Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted, we present ideas on how to process all of this and what you go through, you know, from denial or doubt to the stage where you're beginning to accept parts of it, but you still want to deny it, and to finally the stage where you've been able to process it. Maybe you've had hypnotherapy, maybe you've had emotional release therapy, where you've had memories that have emerged and you have a better understanding of what actually did occur. And I think that it's really important to not hold all of this inside. We have a list of therapists for referral. MUFON doesn't do hypnosis. We vet the qualifications of psychotherapists and of hypnosis practitioners who specialize in this kind of work. They believe it's real, and they help experiencers to process. You enter into a private for-pay relationship with these individuals. We're not back in the dark ages where we had people who were unqualified, who were practicing on people who had these experiences and adding further trauma to what had happened. So I think it's really important for people to go through this. And I know it's expensive, but you know, if you had a tumor, wouldn't you pay money to have that removed? If it's having a huge impact on your life, if you're not able to sleep at night, if you're having panic attacks, if it's impacting the quality of your life, then you really need to go for help. And if you go to a licensed practitioner, like a psychotherapist who can work on trauma therapy, then your insurance will pay for it too. So, you know, I think that that is really important. We also, in Extraterrestrial Contact, took a look at other explanations, such as paranormal. And we know with the overlap of paranormal and contact, we've talked about that earlier in this session. But we went on to identifying entities that are either like from the angelic realm or from the demonic realm. And that's the kind of thing that Denise Stoner specializes in. And so 3 of us joined together to write a chapter on that. And every chapter in the book has a worksheet at the end to help people to process all of this. We even have a chapter in the book on when you want it to stop. And if you're attracting negative entities and they are not extraterrestrials, and the way we differentiate that is the extraterrestrials are more scientists. They have a program that they're carrying out. These negative entities come from the human collective consciousness. Maybe they were really nasty humans prior to this, and they can attach to individuals who have a lower level of vibrational frequency. They're in pain. They might be alcoholics. They might be addicted to opioids. They might just be unkind, nasty people. But these entities can attach to them and feed. The negative entities feed off the negativity. of these humans and can grow and grow and control the human, take the human over, and eventually kill the human. So it's important that if you're having this kind of thing, to be able to identify it and get rid of it, because it's easy to get rid of. And a shaman can do it. A priest who does exorcism can help with that kind of thing. There are a lot of ministers I know who are demonologists who can get rid of that kind of thing. So we added that because all sorts of people come to us and with their own personal stories. And we've been able to identify for some of those individuals, it's simply not extraterrestrial. It's different and it's negative. And so we've offered a dozen suggestions on what to do if you want it to stop, ranging from extraterrestrial contact to a relationship with these negative entities that you just want to get rid of.
In my experience, going back, because I've been in it since '75, I've made a big move. I want to see if you sort of made the move as well. Is that we used to see it as like a strictly physical ETs, ships and stuff, and now it's more moving to the interdimensional. And I'd like to get into a little bit about the weird stuff, because one of the things that interests me the most that you're doing, I have a book, and it's ready to go, but I mean, it'll be maybe another year because I'm working on something before it. But that's the whole thing about apportations and manifestations.
Yes.
That you talk about. This very bizarre sort of, and I don't think a lot of people realize that there's these very sort of paranormal things happening. It's not really just straight, you have an abduction experience, you remember it or whatever. There's all this other stuff. Can you maybe get into that? And did you have this transition that I had, that the more I look at it, I'm going, this is not as physical as I thought it was. It gets weirder and more complex. And you start to really wonder after a while, like, what's really going on here?
Absolutely. And I sort of had my awakening in 2011, around that time frame. Prior to that, I was strictly a nuts and bolts investigator. And when people said to me, well, I had this sensation that something that I couldn't see was walking on my bed, or I had these orbs in my house that seemed to have consciousness, I would just, shove that aside. You don't want to consider that. It's unscientific. And then I came to this sudden awakening, and I had to write about it, that it was unscientific not to consider this information that you hear over and over again. And I have to say, thank God for Jacques Vallée. He was ahead of his time, and I'm so glad that he is back in this field. The field has finally caught up with him, because any investigator who does this long enough realizes that there is an interdimensional component and things that we call paranormal. It happened in my own home when I was growing up, when my mother was an experiencer too, not just Betty Hill. And it happened in Betty's home after, to her and Barney, after their abduction experience.
Can you talk about that? Can you, an example of maybe something? Because I didn't know that Betty had this bizarre stuff going around.
Yes, doors were opening and closing.
Okay.
The hands on the clock were moving ahead.
Wow.
Things were happening. And in my childhood home, after we had a craft land within 250 feet of my childhood home, we started to have these things happen. Doors opening and closing on their own. In one of the rooms in the home, there was a lot of poltergeist activity, things just flying off shelves. When I got divorced, I moved from Colorado with my 2 young children back to my childhood home to stay with my mother. One night, my son woke me up in the middle of the night. He was only 4 years old at the time, and he was making a ruckus in that bedroom. And so I went in to say, get into bed. And I had the night light on. I opened the door and there he was running around the room, jumping into the air, trying to catch this orb. And I could sense from that orb that there was intelligence and that it was so delighted to be playing with him. And I just scooped him up and carried him into my bed for the night. But I was always denying that had anything to do with UFOs and that level of contact. And absolutely, it had everything to do with it. So that's the most fascinating part of all of this to me, is attempting to develop a theory that explains all of these different manifestations as well. We had experiencers in Maine that you might know, the Hewins twins, who had an apport that just when they were doing a show with a Japanese television station, just appeared on the coffee table in their mother's home. Denise Stoner was there to do interviews as an expert and saw that just appear, and their mother saw it just appear on that table. And we sent it off to a scientist to be studied. And it was definitely anomalous. It was a combination of things that could be found on Earth, but not in that kind of combination. So, some of these things are just amazing to me, how they can simply appear, manifest in our environment out of the ether.
Are you familiar with Ray's big guy? I can't remember. Alberto is the guy with all the apports. He's got a whole collection of them in a room or something.
I haven't spent a lot of time with that, but I've heard about it.
You've heard about this guy, yeah. And when I heard, because that's when I first heard about apports, I didn't even know what they were. I used to think Jacques Vallée was nuts. And now I'm going, or you'd ask experiencers. Once I realized there was something to it, you'd say to an experience and they'd say, no, I got dreamed. I don't think I've ever been abducted. And then I'll always say, anything else weird happened in your life? Oh, yeah, they're telling you all this stuff from their childhood. And it's because everybody thinks it's not related. And the more you look at it, you may agree with me, but I mean, it looks like there's something really weird going on here. This is not as simple as it would first appear. Say like Bud Hopkins' early version of what was going on or stuff like that. It becomes more like Jacques Vallée, like it's a giant kabuki theater, and the only thing that's common is we're not alone. That kind of thing. It's
right.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that.
And Dr. Berthold Schwartz, Betty called him, was a psychiatrist from New Jersey who retired down to Florida. And he and Betty were friends, my Aunt Betty, for years. And he kind of specialized in these paranormal kinds of things. And there was a woman that he worked with, her name was Katie. And she could speak and even though she was illiterate, write in ancient classic French, and also these like gold apports would just appear on her. So it would look like there was gold on her skin in pieces. I have one of the photographs that was in Betty's collection of that. Very, very interesting.
Wow. Let's get to a couple as we come near the end here. A couple of the things that people always bring up. MILABs, you did a little bit on MILABs. What's your take on, or your stance on MILABs?
Oh, it's changed over time, but it appears that a lot of people who were either the children of people in the military, especially those who worked around nuclear programs, or scientists, and particularly nuclear scientists, have been taken. And oftentimes their fathers, they found out, were taken as well when they were working on these programs. And so it appears that for them, from what they tell me, the military is still interested in what's going on and tracks them, and so takes some of them from their homes, visits some of them, maybe with the help of some of these non-human entities as well. I think in our questions, it was about 20% of the 516 who took part in our study stated that they had had a MILAB experience.
That's what I think people sort of forget is they think that the government or the CIA or whatever, that they're getting this stuff out of the clouds or something, and they don't realize that the way they get it is to watch the experiencers. That's where they're collecting their intelligence. They haven't got anything more than you and I. And I remember I did an interview with Betty Andreasen and her husband, and he was very upset. And this is my next question about the black helicopters, that they were around his house or whatever. And he had set up this thing and the computer and stuff. And I said, he was very upset. And I said, well, did they ever show Betty how the ship worked? Oh yeah. And he starts talking about drawings and stuff. And I said, well, will you be surprised if they were watching you? I mean, come on, if I was the government, I'd be watching you too. I mean, that's what you need to do, is you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you're not going to pull it out of thin air. So there's this thing, and that comes to the black helicopter thing. What kind of percentage do we have of people, because that's a real bizarre thing that shouldn't really be happening, is they have these black helicopters around them all the time.
Right, and I don't remember that statistic. Do you have it?
It's not. It's more than a few. I mean, I can't remember what it was. I don't know what quote, but the one thing I noticed, and you may want to look at the photographs of the black helicopter, because a lot of them spend their time. They're going to get that black helicopter, and as soon as they hear it, they go racing out with their camera. And a number of them have caught UFOs in the photograph. And I remember I posted it on Facebook one time, and all these people started sending me the black helicopters that they had, and they all had UFOs in them. And I'm saying, has anybody got a black helicopter without a UFO in it? And it was this, it's almost like the near-death experience thing. It's so bizarre that you get these two really bizarre things that look like they're random are both in the same photograph. So the black helicopter, do you think their government, do you think that this is like a manifestation that the experiencer is producing? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, does it often happen the morning after, as if they know?
Yeah, with some experiencers, it happens the morning after. I've received photographs of the black helicopter at fairly close range over the home of that individual. So the military seems to know, or whoever has those black helicopters, that the abduction has taken place. But also, I'm thinking back to my Aunt Betty, who they called them mystery helicopters in those days. And she and groups would go out and see these mystery helicopters in the sky, and would speculate, well, are these non-human entities in a craft that looks like helicopters and really are not? Or is it the military? I think Betty was leaning toward it being extraterrestrial in origin.
Yeah, that's where I had the thing when I saw the UFOs in it. Then I started to think, I don't know, maybe this is not this government, because how would you have a UFO in the photograph? And I've got a collection of these things that people would send me. So it's very bizarre. Same with Men in Black. You've had these experiences with people at the Men in Black where they're threatened not to go public, and it usually happens right after, correct?
Yes, and a small percentage. It's not that prevalent. Denise Stoner is one who's had a lot of experience with the men and women in black, and was even had an experience one time where she and her husband were taken to what seemed like a military installment, and saw these men and women in black as they were not activated. It was almost like they were biorobotic and were just there. Denise has had a lot of very strange experiences with men in black and women in black.
Have you seen patterns? Because I think the Men in Black was probably more back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 40s, like the original case where the UFO explodes in Washington there. The name's escaping me, but 3 days before Kenneth Arnold, they had the Men in Black thing. So have you seen the pattern change in terms of what the intelligence is doing in terms of, because one of the things I think about is reptilians. Like, how long have reptilians been around? It's sort of like the phenomena seems to be changing as we move through the years. Do you find that, or is it basically the same as it was back in Betty and Barney Hill's day?
Well, back in Betty and Barney Hill's day, we had a little bit of the Men in Black kind of thing. There were the next door neighbor saw Men in Black enter Betty's home one day when no one was at home. There was a lot of weird things going on in Betty's house that I don't think were perpetrated by the ETs. I think that it was probably military intelligence going in there to try to push Betty over the edge after Barney died. And I lived with Betty in that time frame. I moved there because of what was happening to her. Let me give you an example. One day, all of the coats out of her closet were thrown on the floor, and Barney's scarf was just laid out over the top of that. Another time, she had collected all of her tax records, and she was going to take them to the accountant. She had them all set to take, and they simply disappeared from her house. They reappeared a couple of months later, this time scattered in a trail around her house. When I was there, we always kept the doors between our apartments unlocked. And I thought that she had come home for lunch. I was downstairs studying. Went up the stairs, looked for her, called for her, couldn't find her. I thought, oh, maybe she's just come in and then went right out again. Got back down the stairs and heard this huge crashing sound. Went running back up the stairs. The closet door was open. There's a baseball bat on the floor. The front door is open. The front door to the house is open. The gate is open. There's a man in a brown suit, kind of a tan colored suit, running up the street. That wasn't your common burglar. So weird things happening to intimidate people. I think about the Herbert Hopkins case up in Maine, where two young men had an experience taken to Kraft, and Dr. Herbert Hopkins had their information. And this little man came, just called Dr. Hopkins, asked if he could go to his house and interview him. And he said yes. And the next thing he knew, I mean, before he could even hang up the phone, there's a knock on the door. It happened that quickly, and this man didn't even know where Herbert Hopkins lived and said he was in a car. So that was impossible. He went into the house. He was wearing a suit from an earlier time. He was wearing spats. He was wearing white gloves, a derby hat, didn't appear to have ears. He was wearing sunglasses, and he held a coin out in his hand. And he said, you know what happened to Barney Hill? He told what happened to him. And watch this coin. And he looked at it and it made it disappear. And he said, that's what happened to Barney Hill's heart. And if you tell this story any further, that's what's going to happen to you. Dr. Hopkins just destroyed all of the evidence that he had in this case because of that. And, you know, that Barney died from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. It wasn't his heart. But, you know, that kind of thing, those old stories, I don't hear that kind of thing as often anymore. And I don't hear really about people being threatened by men in black anymore. I hear about people being tailed, about people's cell phones being tapped, listened into, interfered, their emails being hacked. So it seems to be more of a hacking kind of thing today.
Have you ever been contacted by the government in terms of trying to get information from you or watching what you're doing?
Yes.
Not watching what you're doing, but asking sort of directly, like you get the, you know, the association of Jim Semivan with To the Stars, which is another question, but,
Right.
you know, where they're openly trying to, because you've got the database, you would probably have one of the better databases in the world as to what's going on. If you want to know, you got it. It's what I'm doing. I'm going into Kathleen Marden's head. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So have they approached you in terms of trying to get help as to what's going on?
Yeah. I've made it very clear that I do not want to be followed. I do not want to be harassed. I don't want them tapping my telephone. If they want to ask questions, come to me. That can remain confidential. I won't tell who they are. But yeah, I've had some who have asked me questions and they've told me who they were and who they worked for.
Okay.
Yeah. So, above board, face to face
Yeah.
or over the telephone, and that's fine. I don't mind that. I'm not,
Have you-
I mean, I'm not turning people over to them. I'm not giving
yeah,
them
yeah, yeah,
names
yeah.
or anything. That's all confidential. But if they want to know what's happening, I can tell them.
Have you got any insight on the experiencer survey that's being done by Gary Nolan, Kit Green, and these other supposed 6 people that are doing the DNA and the brain scans of experiencers?
No, I don't have any information on that.
Does that make sense to you what they're doing? At least to me, at least they're dealing with experiencers, which is a heck of a lot more than anybody else is doing. I mean,
Yeah, well, it would be very, very interesting if they were able to identify something in the DNA that separated experiencers from other humans. As long as the thing that I worry about most is hybrids and the identities of hybrids being known, because I worry about retribution. And I think about what Susie Hansen told me about how she was coming to this country to do lectures, and she received a phone call in New Zealand before she left, and it was a threat. If you go to the United States, your life is going to be threatened. And she went anyway. And by the time she arrived back in New Zealand, she nearly died. She had a blood infection. She told me that she went into an elevator. There was a woman there who sprayed something on her, and she became very ill. And so I worry about those things because Susie is very open about being a hybrid and also having a dual soul. And, so I fear that these individuals will be targeted if certain government officials, depending on the administration maybe, know who they are. And when you have people who buy into David Jacobs' theory that these mantis type entities are producing hybrids who look human and are going to supplant all of us. We're all going to be gone. They're going to take over. Then that's a threat. That's a real threat to people of the world. And I don't have that kind of information. Maybe a small group is doing that somewhere. But I've never met anyone who had that sort of information. And I've talked to at least 2,000 experiencers over about a 30-year period, maybe more, and my team, when we meet, we oftentimes discuss different cases, and that's not what anyone else who has a lot of insight into this is saying. It's more of a positive thing. Change in humans, not to supplant us, but to move us ahead on an evolutionary scale where we are less of a danger to ourselves and to these ETs.
Which leads to the question, can you describe your understanding of what a hybrid is? And for the ones that, I think you even had a photo of one or a drawing that was done of one. Where do the hybrids go? The ones that are on the ship, say they and you can go through this whole thing where they show you the baby, you bond with the baby, and then some later on will get to see the child. What's your understanding of hybrids and the program? What are they doing with this program?
Well, I think that there are different levels of hybrids and different programs. From the work that Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, Barbara Lamb have done, we've learned a lot about them, and so many experiencers have observed these like domed, huge test tube like things, very large, with fluid inside and with fetuses in various stages of development. And some of them look like grays. Some people who have interacted with reptilians have seen little reptiles in them. Then they have moved on to more of a mid stage where they are part gray or non-human and part human in their appearance and their abilities. And then as they move to the stage where they look entirely human, then they speak with a voice, but they can also be telepathic. And there were a lot of experiments done, and along the way, they had problems where some of these hybrids were not very nice people along the way, but I guess they have done better at that. Just from what I've read, I have not focused on that in my research. There's also another kind of hybrid, and that is the child who has the DNA of the Earth mother and Earth father, but that DNA has been manipulated in some way to produce these extraordinary children who are incredibly intelligent, kind, like old souls. They are highly empathic, telepathic. They're healers. They can speak in some kind of non-human language. They don't fit in well with humans. They're so different than the human population. But it makes a lot of sense to me that that is the route that any intelligent species should take if they want to help in our development. Because then you have humans raising them on a day-to-day basis. I've never understood how some researchers can think that you could take a non-human who was raised entirely in an alien environment and only had a human mother visiting once a month or once every 6 months or something like that, and then put them on Earth and expect them to be humans. We know enough about animals and humans who have not had human growth and development, who have been neglected, who have just been left on their own, and they never are able to become fully human. There are so many nuances, facial expressions, everything that we do. How can you learn that overnight or very rapidly if you suddenly come from an alien environment and you're put here? That's the question I raise.
Okay, a semi-related question, and I've gotten into a couple of things we brought up today, and when you do the UFO thing and then you do one of these other things, they think you're even crazier than you were before. And one of the things is light language. Have you run up against the people with the light language? Because I suddenly ran up against all these people that were speaking this light language. I was blown away with it. And then you see the orbs that are flying around. And I've got the one woman who won't out herself. Her videos are on the internet, but she's got like 30 hits or on these things. And she's speaking light language and the orbs are flying around. She's just standing there in her kitchen doing this kind of stuff. I actually had because I don't know if you know that they've done a lot of the paranormal stuff in a lab in Philadelphia. And I contacted the professor who's in charge of this. And they've done stuff like channelers, mediums, people praying, people meditating, and they've looked at the brain scans. So I said, would you be willing to take a look at light language people, put them in a fMRI machine, and check the brain scan? And he said, absolutely, we'd love to do it. And then he basically told me, you got to send $60,000 to do this. So that sort of ended the experiment. But have you looked at the light language people, and what did you think about it when you first came? I only became aware of this a couple of years ago, and I was sort of floored. And suddenly it was like, it's almost like the idea, when you buy a car and then suddenly you see everybody else has got the same car. And it was that thing where suddenly they were all over the place. And so what's your take on light language people? Have you run into these people?
Well, I think that it's interesting. but I don't know many people who do this kind of thing. So I haven't really delved into that. I'm so busy doing everything I do that I have to limit what I do, or I'll never see my husband. I don't want to get divorced. So I try to spend quality time with him and, balance my life. And it is very interesting. All of these things are interesting. And, the more you know, the more you research,
Yeah.
the crazier you sound to those who know almost nothing and think that it's all nuts and bolts. I mean, all of this is part and parcel of one phenomenon.
Yeah, I agree. And the other one I did, which we won't talk about, but I did the orbs, and I did a couple of panels on orbs, and that was just like throwing gas on the fire, man. People just, and yet you have it, and I had it because I had it in '76.
Yes.
I had these, we called them ground lights. We didn't even have, there wasn't, the orb hadn't even been invented, the word, and we had them. So I was kind of fascinated when suddenly all these people are taking these photographs. So getting near the end, I want to get from you a sort of a summation, and maybe anything you want to add, that the message you think people need to know that we maybe have not talked about today. But the question I want, first of all, is what do you think is going on after all the people you've talked to? What are we dealing with? Is there a message? And then maybe anything that you think that people need to know about that we haven't talked about today.
Well, I think in terms of the non-humans who are coming here, we are dealing with a non-human intelligence that, according to Major General John A. Samford, in July 29, 1952, stated, these reports go back to biblical times. They come here every century. They came here in 1846. They're back in 1946, and they stayed. And no, they've been here for a very long time. If they wanted to harm us, they would have had the opportunity. If they wanted to enslave us or supplant us, they could have done so. Their technology is so superior to our own, but they appear to be benevolent. And these are the non-humans who come in craft, who appear to be coming from someplace else, not those interdimensional negative just spirits that are here. And I think it's so important for us to learn as much as we can about this. And they say that they've talked to our government leaders, they've talked to our military leaders, and they're just not interested. So what they are trying to do is, from the bottom up, inform humans, the whole human population, of their presence and what they want to achieve. And when that happens, we'll reach a certain tipping point, and just everyone will know, and everything will change, and we'll become a kinder, gentler planet and human population. And I think that's very important. Is there anything else that you wanted me to comment
Well,
on?
just sort of related to that, I think the free survey, they showed 54% said the message was oneness and love. Does that agree with what your people are relating to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And that would be, again, that would be some bizarre thing. Like, why would you make up something like that? I mean, if you're going to make up a story, that's not something you can put in the story.
And there are researchers who say they're lying to all of us, that that we all have Stockholm syndrome, and that they are really here to harm us. And I say that is baloney. We have knowledge that they've been here since biblical times. When they spoke to people in the military from the governments back in the early 50s, they offered support, they offered education, and we simply didn't accept it. So they attempted to accomplish their goals a little differently.
Beautiful. So what are you working on? Your books talk about, I guess you probably haven't, in the oneness virus days, you don't have anything scheduled right now, but what do you got? You got a book coming out? And so talk about what you're doing and your books, and then we'll shut it down.
Okay. Well, in addition to the second edition of Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, I am working on a new book, and it's going to be about the influence that Betty Hill had on me as a mentor to me, that Stanton then had on me as a mentor and colleague, and the way that I grew and changed and became interested in consciousness and my journey toward that end. So I don't know what I'm going to title it yet, but it's going to basically help people who are nuts and bolts realize that there is more to all of this. That's kind of the goal I have in writing the book.
Beautiful. And your books that are at Amazon, Barnes and Noble?
In
And
all formats. And if you want an autographed copy and you live in the United States, it costs too much money to buy it in Canada, but you can purchase it from my website at Kathleen-Marden.com, autographed copies, and even Stan's autographed are on the book that we wrote together.
hopefully we can do an interview when your book comes out. I would love that. And in exchange, what I can do is I can give you access to the Stanton files. I have right now I have 6,000 pages with I originally was going to do some books, and I'm like you, it's like, now I got like other stuff going. I haven't got time to do it. So what I basically did, and I can offer for you may not have time to look at it anyway, but the library is closed. The archives where his stuff
Right.
is. But I'm going back as soon
following.
as they open up again. It's actually one of the places where I think they've only had 2 deaths in that province because they shut it right down when it started. But I can give you access to the Stanton files, and if you want to look through them, you'll have all the files. And what I did, instead of doing anything with myself, I just said, well, people asked, and I gave them access. And I said, if you find anything interesting, tell me, and let them read the files. So if you want, I can give you access. And I would imagine you've seen the collection. It's probably going to be 1 million pages of files when it's all said and done. But I'm going to go back, and I've had them all online. So if you want to take a look at them, there's some stuff already I've seen that involves you. So
I have a lot of Stanton's collection, things that he's given me as we've worked together, and he has a lot of mine as well. He has the Hill files that I had. Anything he wanted to photocopy, I said, fine, photocopy it.
Beautiful.
So
yeah, that's the way you have to do it, is put it out there. Stan had a lot of stuff, and I acknowledge the library for actually, because as you know, he wasn't a Canadian citizen, and the library does not do UFO collections. So the girl that's in charge had to do a lot of pushing to get them to spend, because I think they got full-time archivists working on it, and they're going to go for like 4 years. That's a lot of money to put out to get that collection. But it's a massive collection, and I'm with you. I miss Stan greatly. He had an immense amount of material, and hopefully we can get it out so that his legacy doesn't die.
True. He made a major contribution to this field, and in addition to that, he was just a very kind and wonderful person.
Beautiful. We'll leave it at that. Thank you, Kathleen, and let's talk down the road.
Okay, nice to see you again. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Take care.